prior to that. There we go. We got it.
Okay, got it. Yeah, that's always ominous. Yeah. Well, welcome everybody. Those that have joined us in person and those that might be watching us to the fifth Finding Good podcast. Bree, are we on 5 hours? Always check in. Like there should be something. Yeah. So what we're doing here, what we're doing today specifically is each week we go over the question of the week that's outlined in our membership it's a question people try on with each other and gauge. We're going to talk about the science behind that question a little bit. We're going to showcase the question and this question, the question this week is what, Bree? Just categorize it.
Yep, it's what's one thing that happened in your week that made it a little better?
And what we'll try to do this week is actually spend a little more time than we have in weeks past on the science behind the question and even the category. So all of the questions we design are based on what we call the FIRES model. And FIRES is an acronym for feelings, influence, resilience, ethics, and strengths. And what category would this one be in, Bree? This putting you on the spot, but I'm trying to.
I was actually thinking about this because it could go different directions depending on how someone answered this question. But in a nutshell, I put it in feelings.
Yep. Something good that happened this week. It would be feelings or influence. And without getting too far into those, just really explaining to everybody here some of the why it's so important, like what we're doing here in the conversations and what's actually happening. So I'll explain that a bit. Bree is going to walk through the question of the week outline to show you some of the science behind that. And then we're going to try it on so you all see it. But the reason we talk about the FIRES model or try to be aware of the type of questions we're asking. And a simple question like, what's something that happened last week that made your, if you will, day or week a little better, is based on the simple science of our negativity bias, right? Our brain is designed to see essentially at a 5-to-1 or a 10-to-1 ratio, more bad than good. And it does that because it's trying to protect itself. And so simply asking somebody like, what's a good thing they saw or what's a good thing that happened in the prior week is actually helping their brain kind of have a more balanced, if you will, memory, right? Because if you think about it, like when you ask people simple questions like, how was your day? Because that question is neutral, people will then, because of that bias, say, either give you an efficiency question like, oh, that's fine, or it'll prompt them to re-engage in the negative things they remember. Like how many times have you asked, how was your day? And the other person starts complaining about the boss or the pain in the neck they had, or it was rain, or you just reinforce all of the challenges or problems. And that's again, by design. So by purposely creating a positively oriented question, what we're doing is engaging them in the things that literally they might have missed because your brain is kind of filtering that information. But more importantly, in having the deeper conversation about what that was, it allows them to actually, what we're trying to do is trigger that feeling of connection that happens between two humans. And there's a biological combination for that, but simply put, asking about someone's experience, right? What's a good thing that happened allows them to share their story. And in sharing their story and having somebody interested in our story, we create connection. Now that's a big 500-foot flyover of a lot of pretty complicated things that are happening that aren't that complicated, but naturally what we're trying to do, what we're really focused on is how do we create that sense of connection in a conversation with the added benefits of focusing on something positive and affirmative that we want to reinforce. How was that, Bree? It's a good kind of little run through there?
Love it. Well done.
Or with a transformational question, what was good about that, Bree?
What was good about that? Oh man, no, I love that. We're working on questions here.
That's right. So what we're going to do is, next is Bree's going to share the screen and show you the question of the week. This is an outline we've been creating and modifying since we started this whole thing 3 years ago during the pandemic. The question of the week outline is an outline that we have that we use for the calls that Bree and I run during the week, but also it's designed so that you can use them. You can use this out on your own with friends or family or even complete strangers to have what we call a finding good conversation, which again, it's designed to create that experience of connection. So walk us through this, Bree.
All right, awesome. So we have our question of the week here. As Brian mentioned earlier, what's one thing that happened in your week that made it a little better? Now we're gonna, we mentioned what fires category this is. So we've got fires, which basically are the different buckets that we put our questions in for what they might inspire. This one could be a feelings or an influence question, depending on how someone responds and what they choose to look at this, the lens that they choose to look at this question through. And I'll also make a comment that this is one of our easier questions. I'll say quote unquote easier because when we look at this question, it doesn't require someone to take responsibility for why their week was a little better. They don't have to take responsibility for that one thing. So it's a little bit easier for them to respond. The next level up, kind of harder question would be, what's one thing that you did to make your week a little better? That's adding on another layer of responsibility. It makes it a little bit more challenging for the person to respond to. But we've got this great reference here from the authors of The Power of Bad, How Negative Effect Rules Us and How We Can Rule It. And they have incredible insights of basically how, and something that we've worked through this lens for the last 3 years, our brain is programmed to look at the negative stuff. And that's quite an intentional thing. It helps us to be aware of our surroundings and to identify the danger and then take action on the danger. That's why our brain is constantly pointing out those negative things, if you will. But it's up to us to try to balance that out. And what we can do to balance it out, there's sort of two lenses that we can look at this. So one of them is by asking someone the question to think about what is that thing in your week that made it a little better. We're almost turning on a little light bulb in their head to start thinking about, well, what are the good things? Because chances are they are not focused on that one little thing that made their week better. They're probably focused on the things that are making their lives a little bit harder, a little bit more challenging. So by asking them that question, it's going to create a new thinking process for them, if you will, where they're going to have to kind of take pause and say, what is something that was a little better? And why did that happen? What was my part in it? We can ask them a number of questions to help them sort of see this good thing that happened. And then what might happen for them is that in the future, they might be on the lookout for those things a little bit more. And it could ultimately, the more conversations we have around this, change that mindset so that they're looking through a more positive lens than that negative lens. So that's one thing that happens to the respondee for the questions. Now, as the question asker, there's some pretty cool things that can happen for us too. So first off, I'm going to be kind of relating to the person as they're responding. I might enjoy that thing that they're talking about, that one thing that made their week a little bit better. I might enjoy getting that insight from them. So that's one thing that in turn could make my week better. And then another aspect of it is it could help me to start notice other things in my environment as well that are improving my week. So it's one of those like double whammy questions where the respondee is getting something out of it, but as a question asker, I'm getting something out of this as well. So that's our question of the week, Brian.
Awesome. All right. Well, let's pull it back out. Now let's do the fun piece. So it's sort of easy. And I think sometimes like when we're sharing these questions or when people are talking about questions, we tend to think like, if I have the right question, then that's the thing that's going to create the connection or inspire the conversation. The question design is important. We're really trying to make it easier. I mean, the simplest way of saying this is we're trying to make it easier for that person to access the regions of those memories. And we do this knowing that actually sharing the things that we're proud of that are meaningful to us is more psychologically dangerous than sharing the problems and the challenges. right? That's a big concept, but simply put, you put yourself more at risk when you talk about the things you care about than you do when you talk about the things that, if you will, you're mad about. And so like the question design is about like, how do I make it easy and safe for this person to talk about? But making the conversation successful is really about our intention behind asking it. And so just like we do every week, what I'll do is I'll find a volunteer. Sometimes that volunteer is Bree, who gets voluntold. But and Lisa, I know we've had you on once or twice. And so Greg or Tammy or Kim or Tamara, if you want to turn on your camera, anybody want to take a shot at what we'll do is 5 minutes of me starting with this question and then showing you where the conversation goes when we follow kind of the rules of that outline, which is I can only ask questions. I can't give any SOFA. So that's suggestion, opinion, feedback, or advice. Stay within the 5-minute window. And if there's any questions I ask that you're not comfortable answering, you just say move on and we move on. Yeah. So with that outline, anybody want to be the, anyone want to give it a go? It's like the game of 1, 2, 3, not it. Greg, you took yourself off of mute. That's like, raising your hand at an auction, right?
I was just about to come with the volunteer, but before I forget, can I ask something about what Bree was talking about?
Yeah, no, that's a good time for anybody to check in. We just covered a whole lot of information in a short period of time. So yes, anybody, if you have questions or comments, go ahead, Greg.
I have a feeling this will kind of play through in this part of the exercise, but you mentioned about the structure of that question and kind of one of the easier ones in that maybe the responder doesn't necessarily need to take responsibility for, I think you said for how. And so I was just kind of reflecting on, I was in on last week's practice session for the first time, and it seemed like the follow-on questions really do start to probe about how. And so I was just kind of thinking that, do they tend to end up in the same place? Or am I thinking too soon about maybe the format?
Yeah, so what you probably experienced there is, so Greg, on our what we call just in the community, people can jump on and ask these questions with really no background on them. There's really, as we in our certification programs, in our workshops, we show people there's a bit of an art in terms of like what follow-up questions look like. And so yeah, you can start with what we call, there's no ownership in the question when what's something that made your week better. And then as the person answers it, for instance, if I was to ask Bree what's something and she said, well, I did this, then she actually graduated the question into that more into the more challenging region. And what we teach people is like staying in permission. So the reason when Bree says it's easier or harder, we're actually talking about the degree of psychological safety that has to be there between both people for that question. So if you really ramped it up, like, what did you do this week that made somebody else's week a little better? Right now we've got a question that requires a high degree of psychological safety, meaning I'm going to have to take a lot of risk in answering it if it was asked of me. And so sometimes we can start low and somebody says, I'm more comfortable here. But what we're looking for is, and why we have, and we've been doing for years, these sessions where you only ask questions is so that you learn to listen for the signals of the other person saying it's safe to go here or it's not safe to go there. Does that make sense?
It really does. Yeah. And thanks. And it was just my forecasting even last week was thinking about, well, this is more of an interrogation and I should have the right layering questions and we should get to an endpoint, and then realize we just kind of let it flow and I saw the benefit from it. So I'm perfectly willing to let it flow, but I completely understand what you were describing there, especially around the psychological safety aspect, which is why I get a little concerned about the question interrogation aspect of it, but it didn't really play out like that at all last week.
Yeah, it can feel that, like it's super common what you're talking about, like, oh, because what we're conditioned to think is this person is asking a question because they're taking us somewhere, right?
Yeah.
So our teacher asks a question because we want an answer. Our parents ask a question because, right, what did you learn today? Well, I learned this. Okay, that satisfies you. But what we're doing here is actually, and we call it from the beginning, authentic curiosity. So my job is actually not to take you anywhere. Matter of fact, the more I think that I know where you're going, the worse the questions become to some degree, right? It actually kind of breaks the connection down. And so my job is actually to like really clarify the picture. So when whatever it is you tell me, that's where the exploration begins. And the benefit, and what we call really one of the biggest concepts you have to learn, or that we learn when we try these out, is my job is to look at our conversation as though you're like Netflix. And so I'm going to ask you a question and you're going to start to paint the picture, right? And my job is to engage in that picture for you to tell me the whole story. And the benefit for me is just like the benefit of watching any TV show is I might get inspired, I might get engaged, I might get, right, I get the benefit of the story if the story is what I stay into looking for, right? Yeah. And
Fantastic. Yeah.
that skill is a lot harder than it sounds. And again, because of how we generally engage questions. So if you're ready, should we give it a go?
Yeah, absolutely. Bree, I think I was just going to say I was fully intent on leading you to a certain direction last week when we were going through that, and I vividly remember what Brian's describing is I somehow changed the tune in order to clarify the picture that you were describing, and I got the picture clear in my head, and then I was interested in more clarity. So that really resonates there. So thanks for putting words to it.
Yeah, what you're describing is when we get into the natural process. Like this is literally how our brains were designed to connect, and how we were like why listening was this adaptive function that our brains really kind of created so much around, and why connection is as important to our brains as food and water. And so when we get into that natural state, which to some degree is what we're trying to coach people on, then it feels surprisingly easy. Yeah. So let's have a go on that, Greg. So Greg, I'm gonna, again, 5 minutes of questions ish. I actually have the timer here, Bree. So I do have one thing prepared today, right? So what went well today? That's my answer. But I like to just to kind of clarify, Greg, again, or to reinforce, if I ask questions that you're not comfortable with, especially because these are being recorded and seen, like feel free to, to say move on, and we'll go find a different part of the story. So with that, in the last week, what's one thing that's made your week a little better?
I did access what I felt is one little thing is I did get an email that came from a friend and colleague that on my behalf went and spoke to someone within his new company about a project I'm working on that might ultimately lead to a sale into their company. And basically it was just a quick email saying I met with them. They were very interested. They're going to review the demo and come back to me. And I was surprised how fired up I got about that.
Yeah. Why do you think you got fired up about it? Like,
it was a positive message on a Monday where I wasn't necessarily looking or expecting much momentum on that particular effort. And it had been about almost a week or two since we had last spoken. And so I was surprised, and it was probably just a validation of what I know, that there's a valuable message in here. And I was glad that he was able to relay it to someone who also thought it was valuable.
So what part of that was, because you said this was like the positive little jolt, what part was it? Was it the fact that somebody else had sent it? Or as you say, like they communicated it, or was it the feedback that it got? Like which part of it was like really helped to propel your week?
I have to say probably both. I see both and I feel both in that this is a friend and a colleague who this is where I'm starting out with some of these demos with some of these my past colleagues, um, and everyone's busy and everyone's going off in a lot of different directions. And what I was just really somewhat delighted in is that he actually didn't drop it and actually had invested even a bit more on his own. And it just felt like it reminded me what not just a colleague, but was actually a good friend in the past. So I think that was a good part of it, in addition to the business aspect of it, that, well, there's likely an opportunity here.
Mm. And when he invested that, when this person invested that extra time, like what did that mean to you? Like, did it say something about the relationship, or did it say,
Yeah.
did it say more about the idea? Like what was so meaningful about that?
You know, again, both, because I think I would have trusted him to tell me why he wasn't going to invest any time and do anything about it. And so there's a little validation about the whole idea and the status of this project, but also just the fact that he did what I would do in terms of reciprocity and put a little more effort into it as a friend. And that was validation of it. And so it just kind of felt good in a surprising fashion and on a Monday.
Mm. And you've said 2 or 3 times, like on a Monday, like what was, what
Yeah.
is it like, why was on a Monday so important?
You know, I think it was because on this Monday, I was recognizing a different pace of a momentum of the week recently, and realizing that seems like Monday, rather than the cliched Monday, I was really focusing on how my weeks have been going and where the momentum is from the prior week. And I just do note, because I used to have floods of communication come in on Monday, and this has been a different 6 months for me. And that flood doesn't come in necessarily. I'm generating some of the activity differently. And so I noticed that even within the opening of a week, it takes a little revving for Monday and Tuesday to kind of get into the flow differently. And so I happen to be contemplating that this particular week about redefining Monday and seeing if I want to do something about that, accept it, and I was plugging this in about what could happen in the beginning of a week.
And the fact that that happened at the same time, like what was the feeling then?
Yeah, a reminder of just probably sticking to some things and making sure I'm staying constructively mindful in some of these areas, because it does have a benefit when something like this happens. And I know that I thrive on that, and I get inspiration from even the little things. And so sometimes you got to put something out there to get something back. And I think that's really, turns out that's what I was sitting with this Monday. It was actually the end of Monday to where I was really putting that together after the Monday.
That's awesome. And so that's 5 minutes. Give Greg a round of applause.
Okay, great.
The brave one here today. Yeah. So I always start with the person that engaged the question. And Greg, I want to ask the question this way. The benefit to you of that conversation was what?
Almost making probably more connections about that particular incident than I had thought about. And recognizing a bit of vulnerability with sharing it with others, but then also somewhat appreciative to be able to share with others.
Right. Now, and this is for everyone, Greg or anybody else can answer. Like the second question I always ask is, what was the benefit to me of having that conversation with Greg? And not just he's on the podcast, so we have a podcast guest, but what was the benefit of me of asking those questions and engaging in Greg's story that way? Like what could be in the moment the benefit to me, and then even beyond that? Go ahead, Tammy.
Yeah, I wonder if there was something to just like you also notice things differently because Greg is surfacing different ways of looking at things.
Yeah, tell me more. Like I think I'm tracking with you. Like notice things in myself, or what do you mean?
Well, I think it could be a lot of different things. But just to hear Greg kind of processing out loud, as you were taking him deeper with those questions, you hear him processing, and so that makes you maybe process along with him, or process something similarly. It's just an opportunity to see how different brains work.
Right. And I'm curious, Sammy, was that your experience, like as an observer, like you processing similar situations for yourself as Greg was sharing his?
Yeah, kind of. I think, yeah, maybe I'm projecting on you a little.
Oh, no. I think what you did is you perfectly defined it. Like, yes, that's what we're intentionally actually trying to do there. It's like our brain has this natural self-referencing. And when we engage in a question that's actually about sharing experience, and I do this because when we share experience or we're sharing a story that someone has asked for, then we have this, I call it status equilibrium. We feel like equals. And when we feel like equals, my brain doesn't have to run a lot of background noise. And that happens, like I asked Greg, what was it about the week that was better for him? Now, had I asked Greg, like, hey, tell me how to make my week better, then all of a sudden I've asked Greg to be of higher status than me, because I'm asking for advice. That's why the avoidance of advice, SOFA, so suggestions, opinion, feedback, or advice, isn't because we don't get that or there's not value in those things. But for connection to happen, status has to, right? It doesn't have to, it's more likely to happen when we have that kind of equal balance, right? And so asking that question there allows me then to self-reference. My brain's calm enough to think about my own experiences, versus when I ask somebody for advice, my brain activates and says, well, that doesn't work for me. And that's why it's, you know what I mean? Like all that pushback we get for advice. And so that, and so what happens in being able to ask for that is I process it beneficially, but anyone listening, so Tammy, it might've been projection, but it was really actually like all of us are likely having that similar experience. And Greg gets to be of value to everyone by just clarifying the story. Yeah.
I want to add on to that as well. So something that we have a tendency to do in conversation, this is a very normal thing, is in many other conversations, Greg would say, this is what happened on my Monday. It was great. And I would go, I've had the same experience too. This is what I felt. By me jumping in and then relating, which is a natural human thing to do. We're saying, I see you, I've been there too. We then lose the opportunity to connect with Greg on a deeper level, because we've decided to say, I know exactly how you feel. I've been there as well. And that takes away from the connection moment. There was the opportunity with Greg, instead of me saying, oh, I love how that feels, I've been there as well. I want him to tell me more about how it feels. Tell me about what it means to you. What were the particular aspects of it? So to move out of that assumption, because I've been there before, I know how it feels. We're removing those assumptions and asking Greg, tell us more about this experience and why it was important to you.
And Tamara, I hope I'm pronouncing that name correctly, chatted in. I think Greg was describing his positive experience. Being able to share that feeling vicariously also feels great for me. Yeah, and that's again one of the cool parts of asking this question is like everybody's had the experience where you walk into a room and somebody's like upset, and what happens to the mood of everybody else in the room, right? We take that, it's almost viral, if you will, and we're purposely doing that in here. The more I lean into Greg's questions, like, tell me about, like, really describe that, like, bring me into the story. And sometimes that's with the question of like, what did it feel like to have that said? What did it mean to you to have that? Like, where was this? Like really paint the picture. And the more Greg paints that picture, the more his brain actually re-engages the memory. And by re-engaging the memory, he re-engages the emotion in that memory. And once and as Greg is feeling that, I get to actually kind of share in that feeling. When we see that, like 8 years ago when I first started this with a group of friends, and I met with that group of friends this morning on a phone call, and we asked each other what went well in the prior week. That's the only thing we can talk about. What we noticed, because we were doing that call at 4 o'clock on a Friday, was that, like, you're really tired on a Friday and we go and engage this conversation, and now it's 5 o'clock and we're all, which is why we moved it to Wednesday morning so that we could actually get that good feeling and then do something with it, versus like Friday, like, oh, now I want to go, oh, but the week's over. But yeah, that, like, we're almost purposely like generating that, and as Tamara said, like that vicarious feeling, right? And you notice that in the groups of three, it's this really kind of efficient way to make us all feel better without being like, hey, just cheer up today, Greg, or remember all the good things that happen, right? Which is, like, essentially what we're doing. But what we're doing in asking you is allowing you to do that on your terms, right? When I say think about the good things that happened, or like, then I'm sort of like telling somebody, like, feel better because of me, versus if I can engage in your story, then you can share, at meeting you wherever it is you're at. Greg, go ahead. Yeah.
I do kind of parlaying off what Bree was saying. I just kind of wonder, but first of all, I'm getting definitely getting the point here as far as the difference in the questioning and the relating. I was just kind of wondering if you can kind of draw, so from a connection perspective, is there some value of being relatable as part of the discussion? And maybe can, like, I see for this exercise, not necessarily filtering it in, but in a course of some conversations, do you really find yourself refraining from any of that relatability, I guess, and for the value of connection?
What I've found is that by doing that, connection happens more often. And that's not in the calls, that's like out in real life. And the reason, so how we describe it, and this is especially important for when we teach this in sales, because there's a whole different, like, you're trying to create a relationship with your client, but did connection happen? And we know that, like, we've all had the experience of, like, I've asked, I'm sitting with a client, I asked them a bunch of questions, we had a long conversation, and we leave and we know the feeling wasn't there, right? Like, or the client leaves, and this is some of the research that we were doing, is like one of the number one complaints of salespeople is the salesperson doesn't listen. And that response will come after the salesperson has asked them like 4 or 5 questions. So the salesperson's like, we listened, but we didn't. And what the client is actually talking about is connection. And the reason why it's important to separate, just as we're talking about, like, for me not to, if you will, like, oh, I do the same, or I like really like try to share, is because what we're trying to do in that moment is say, oh, we have this in common, right? And we're often taught that like connection, like we can have something in common and that's connection. We're taught to like seek that out. And that's not necessarily bad, but from a connection standpoint, it's actually quite fragile. Because if you and I decided like, what do we have in common? Maybe a political party, or maybe we have in common, you know, this a football team, or maybe we have in common that we like this kind of food. That connection is stable until what happens?
It's not.
You're right. Exactly. Yeah, that's the simplest way to put it. It's stable because it's not. Because it's not. It's really what we're connected on is things that are outside of our control. And the whole, like the underlying, like the FIRES model itself is about how do we connect on things that are common to all people, right? And so the moment I say, so if I ask you a simple question like, hey, when were you the happiest this week? Similar to the question I just asked you, and you say, well, I did this. And I stop and say, oh, that makes me happy too. I've actually just now put my definition into your story. Right? And so being able to say, oh, what about that makes you happy? Or like we did in our talk, like, whoa, what was the actual feeling is about me not assuming what you said. And when I don't assume and I ask the correspondent, I continue to like really get the clarity in that. That allows your story to actually be told in a way that it wouldn't if somebody wasn't asking you those questions. So that allows clarity for you. And in doing so, that allows a level of validation. And it's in that validation that the connection happens. So I really coach against like, you know, we really like reinforce that, like, yes, there are times of like, yes, we like this together, but like when I'm looking for connection, I'm really looking for the clarity. And if I bring myself into it, then what happens is that other person starts to perform or they stop telling their story. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I am thinking of playing it out in different scenarios to where like, okay, do you ever wrap it up and draw something relatable at the end and then
Yeah.
go into another topic? And like, or really it's just because I wonder if I felt more connected because I shared with other people here, or do I feel connected with you because of the engagement of the questions and answers? And we like, I don't really know if you were, you know, if it was resonating at anything I was saying necessarily.
Yeah, I'm curious, Greg, do you, so a lot of times when we ask somebody a question, like, well, or we ask somebody and we're listening to somebody, we listen to them a while, like 10 minutes, and then we get this like, okay, now it's my turn to talk. Like, you know, that I'm curious, like, I just asked you the questions for 5 minutes. Did you have that underlying feeling like, oh, now I need to ask Brian questions or not? Do you remember having that?
Not that particular feeling. I don't think so.
Yes, and that's like, so this is what, like, we call that the equal value exchange. So normally if somebody would have asked you questions and you talk like that, your brain would trigger that like reciprocity rule, like, oh, I've got to give you time. But when you're able to share a story like that, and what's happening, why reciprocity isn't happening in that moment is your brain's actually feeling like this person is genuinely interested in this. Like this person is getting value from this. And when that happens, like two things happen. For me, I can leave the conversation and not feel like you talked the whole time and I didn't get a moment to talk, because we both got value from it. And then you have the same feeling of like, I get to talk about my experience and what's going on without that thing that we all do, which is, oh, sorry, I'm dumping all my problems with you. Like we stop because we feel that value disequilibrium, or it's what we call status disequilibrium. And when you take that out of the equation, it's that, oh, yeah, I can have this and not need that reciprocity to happen. And quickly on that bigger bit is what I tend to tell people is like, this isn't now how I have all my conversations. My wife will tell you I have plenty of communication shortcomings, right? But it's really, it's when I think about connection, it's really more what we try to approach it is that every time I'm interacting with a human being, connection is the most vital thing. So I might not have all the conversations like this, but I want to have one, right? Like I want to engage, I want to connect with them on their experience somewhere in there. And I usually try to do it at the front end, because I know that like once my brain feels that sense of connection, that this person sees my value and the other person has the same experience, everything else we're trying to do becomes easier. Because when we don't feel connection, then every one of us have had this in a group or a one-on-one meeting, we hear in the back of our head, what did they think about me? What did they, right? We have all of these like questions of, do they see my value? But they show up as like, do I have a, you know, something in my nose? Like, what's wrong with me? Like, we continue because that's our brain's fight or flight saying, do I fit in? And so what we're trying to do on with a question like this is answer that question, like without any doubt. And we know we answer it when we feel it. And as you were engaging in the questions, I wonder, Tammy or Lisa, did you see any changes in tone, inflection, or body language with Greg? And Bree, you as well. Like when I was asking the question, did you see any changes? And we're a bit removed from it, so maybe you don't remember, but did anybody notice any changes in Greg's tone or inflection or body language?
So
Bree, what did you notice?
I noticed, I can't remember what the question was, but he paused and laughed as he was thinking about his response. So that was one kind of difference in posture that I noticed. And then there was another one where it was a question, it was like a either or question that you asked Brian, was it this thing or was it that thing? And he responded to both of them. But the second one he paused to think about it a little bit longer. Yeah. And there was a little bit of movement where he was like, what was it about that situation?
At least it said, I saw him smiling more and he seemed to light up when he was realizing the good feelings. And that said that to your point, Bree, but also in what Lisa had just written, like that light up moment or that lean in moment or that change in reflection, for me, that's like, oh, that's Greg. Like Greg just showed up.
I try and hide it, but oh well.
Yeah, and to that point, like we all do, right? We all are natural. We have that natural like defense in there, and then this person, I can be myself a bit, and so that's really the goal. Is like we're creating an environment in the conversational part of this. Now, when we move into like how we're using it for leadership or sales, right? We're still trying to get that like, oh, here's the person. I've made it safe for the person to show up. Now we can start doing all of the other things that we need, right? And that like, and that's purposely creating psychological safety in a one-on-one conversation or again in a group conversation. And the reason we have folks jump on calls and use the 10-minute outline and do this with strangers is to really get good at this. It's about training your brain to see that, right? And you start doing it a few times and you see that and you experience it and your brain says, I want more of that. And then you get almost competitive like Bree and I, and we love nothing more than to corner each other with like kind of the high psychological safety questions like, well, what does that say about you as a parent, and just sit back and watch the like, the little like chin quiver, like, oh, we got a good one, right?
Ryan, Greg, on his first call last week in our practice session, he made me cry.
Oh, nice. Good job,
yes.
Greg.
Yay.
It's just
he's a pro.
And I always, like, whenever we talk about like the emotional responses that come from these, because it can be laughing, it can be tears, it's to create a space where somebody gets to show up on as themselves is not common in our current world. It's not common because on one end we don't have as much time. I talk all the time about, we used to sit around at the dinner table for an hour, right? We used to go on car rides for multiple hours. We used to walk and now the time that we have to connect is just limited, right? And so really what we're trying to show here, and what's behind transformational listening, is that connection hasn't become any less important. It's actually more important, but having a tool to create it like efficiently and consistently, and within that short time window, that's really what the design is here. And we started creating it during the pandemic, when doing that was hardest. And if we can do it online while we're all stuck at home in little 10-minute conversations, then what can we do with it, organizationally? What can we do that with our clients, and what can we do when we actually make connection sort of the foundational part of the organizations and the communities we're a part of, because that's where it all begins anyway. And I did 10 or 15 years of culture work using neuroscience, safety culture, leadership culture, organizational culture, and how do we change culture using neuroscience. And this part of communication, and specifically questions, has just always been, for me, the most salient, but also the most easy to use, because there's a tool, like, do this, try that, right? But we created this methodology in the last 3 years because I was essentially frustrated that, like, we know questions are important, we know that some of this is happening, but we don't have models that we can use to create it consistently. Like, we all sort of have connection by accident. When you have a lot of time in an interaction, you can have connection by accident. You can, like, eventually, if you sit on the couch watching football long enough, the person sitting next to you is going to show themselves, right? They're going to say, oh, and you're going to see them momentarily, right? Football was a horrible example there, but like, when we got long interactions, we tend to accidentally do that. But because connection is in such a short supply, I just don't think we can, for the relationships, for our businesses, for our clients, if we make connection be an accidental thing, then we're likely going to continue to have, a pretty significant shortfall, which is what the majority of the country experiences on a daily basis. Yeah. I went down a rabbit hole there, didn't I?
That's awesome. And I didn't want to monopolize and go down any hole necessarily. I'm just excited about seeing it play out, and what you really said about when you added some perspective to it, and what you were trying to do with the perspective, that was really helpful.
Oh, good. Yeah. Any other questions or comments? I know we're rolling into the last 10 minutes of this, and oftentimes the questions of, like, we focus here, and we focus always on the conversation, but the conversation is really, where the whole thing starts, right? Because when you think about even organizational culture change, it's a conversation at a time. Any relationship you've ever been in can be built or broke in a single conversation, right? And so this is about, like, if we understand the primaries in there, like, we can build that starting with the conversation, but then moving into, some of the bigger things we're trying to create together. Questions or comments about either the conversation I had with Greg or the half-hour diatribe I just went on? Give me an opportunity to nerd, and I will nerd all over for as long as I can. If you can't tell, I sort of enjoy this stuff, right? And but there can be a lot in it, and it's important to be able to engage it and not be like identifying that it requires more work. And I use this example all the time, like, you can know everything about how to create six-pack abs, but that's not going to give you six-pack abs, right? You have to go do the thing, right? And connection is the same way. Like, the reason we designed the certification program, the workshops, and these weekly sessions and the membership as somewhat interactive, and you can change your degree of interactiveness based on your comfort level, but it's in that interaction that we build the muscle, right? Like, and not just the muscle of, like, how to ask questions and how to engage, but that the more your brain experiences connection, the easier it is for it to do the work to create it. And the inverse of that is also true. The more isolated you feel, the harder it is to actually create connection. It's this really counterintuitive thing that like once I spiral into that, because I like my brain has this like, no, let's not do that. Like I don't want to talk to anybody. I don't want to be around anybody. And when that happens, you know, to an individual, there can be, you know, big, obviously hazardous consequences. And at the same time, if that happens on our teams that we work with the clients that we work with, you know, like that can create, you know, that can really stymie any sort of progress or engagement that we're having. And so like, if we understand that underlying all of that is just this natural need for connection, and that like, that's not just a nice to have thing, it's as important as food and water, then we can address it more directly. Notice that I was practice active listening too. So tomorrow put in there, notice I was practice active listening. So I have a frame on that, if you will, right? So active listening teaches you a lot of good skills like pay attention, move in, lean in, all of this stuff, right? What we show is that when you ask a question that you are inherently interested in the answer, that you know what, like so when I engage in Greg, I know that I don't know what story, but I know if I ask the right questions, he's going to give me every bit as good of a story as I'm going to get tonight on Netflix if I decide to watch a movie. And when I know that, I don't actually have to remind myself to do any of those things. Active listening is outlining things your brain naturally does when you're interested. And when we engage questions that we know are going to benefit us, that we know what we're interested in, then we have to remind ourselves of those things so much less. That it's like I'm naturally leaning in because that's what your body does when you're interested and engaged, right? I'm making eye contact because I'm actually kind of looking. And that eye contact is a little weird here online, obviously, but what I'm looking for, like I'm actually now watching Greg because I'm looking for that interaction. I'm looking for the change in the shoulder and the eyes getting big, because not only does that tell me about the story a bit more, but like that's where that vicarious, like, you know, if you will, sharing of emotion is sort of happening, right? Like again, it's just like getting really excited watching a good movie. Like, oh, where is it going to go? And what is this? And nobody has to remind people to be like, hey, remember to pay attention to the movie while it's in the really, you know, where the big action scene is happening. You know, we watch the whole theater move forward, right? And so that it's really just, how do we create the same thing with this other human I'm interacting with, knowing that that story is as captivating if I know what to look for as any movie you're going to watch, right? Yeah, where are we at with time, Bree?
I mean, we're pretty much
12:57.
there.
There we got it. We brought it home. Yeah. Well, I hope you all found this beneficial. I tend to stay on afterwards for anybody that has any questions. For those that may be watching and all of you listening, I very much encourage you to join the $5 community. It's $5 a month. We have a bunch of resources on there. We have videos. We'll be adding stuff like the recordings of these on there every week. That helps kind of support us to get the little mini guides and that out to as many folks as we can. And if you're interested, we have the certification program. We've got a new group launching next week, and that's yeah, that's super fun. We're finally getting the certification really dialed in, and then finally reach out if you're interested in any workshops or keynotes we do, because obviously I have no trouble talking about this. So and no trouble being engaged and fired up to talk about this. We've seen a lot of really powerful conversation. We hear them all the time from parents saying, I just had a conversation with my kid that I haven't had in forever, to, you know, CEOs saying, you know, this conversation might have just saved me from losing, you know, my biggest customer or my best employee. And you know, the more we can create that, the more inspiring it is for us, not just because, you know, there's those ancillary benefits, but because we know underlying all of this is what our Surgeon General outlines as the biggest health epidemic in this country, and that is loneliness, right? And so at the base of this, how we can create and use connection as a way to get some of the other needs met and that like at the same time solve one of the biggest challenges we have as an organization. That's what our company is about, and we hope have you all as part of it. So you can kill the recording, Bree. I usually hit that, but I don't know how to do it on the iPad.